the 20th century, hundreds of different kinds of animals have disappeared from the wild. The animals in these stories are all victims of human greed. A passenger pigeon, just like all the other pigeons, except perhaps prettier than most, with a slate blue back and pale red breast. It had a different call from other pigeons. Instead of cooing, it shrieked, chattered and clucked. But the passenger pigeons were probably more numerous than any other bird that ever existed, so their collective sound was a cacophony. When the screaming flocks of passenger pigeons flew over the North American forests, they blocked out the sun. In fact, they looked more like tornadoes than birds. They travelled as great rolling cylinders of sound and feathers, sometimes 15 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. James J. Audubon, the famous American bird artist, estimated that one flock he saw contained 2 billion pigeons flying at 98 kilometers an hour. For many people, it summed up America. In terms of sheer abundance, no one had ever seen anything like it anywhere else. As luck would have it, the early settlers found that the passenger pigeon was also very good to eat. It was this combination of food and plenty that made the bird an American symbol. Everything about this new continent was prolific. Distances seemed to stretch ahead forever. Rivers teemed with fish. There were ample forests to provide enough houses to resettle the whole of Europe, if Europe wanted to come. But as the limitless forests were felled, potential farmland was lost too. A formerly unmapped wilderness could be very speedily transformed into a hub of civilization as settlers built houses and roads. Even the vast distances could be conquered by new forms of transport. But the new Americans only needed to look up to see that nothing would ever really change. The sky-darkening passenger pigeons were still there, in flocks so thick you could knock them out of the air with poles. Or there were much more effective methods. Without even having to aim, you could shoot them in their hundreds and thousands. Millions even, as they were slaughtered and sent by rail to help feed the growing populations of the big cities of the East. By the 1860s, surprisingly enough, their numbers had begun to dwindle, though no one seemed to notice. The birds were smoked out of trees, netted or baited with whiskey-soaked grain. Day-long shooting contests were held, and one man claimed a prize for shooting 60,000 birds. After all, they're not too difficult to pluck. Sometimes they were captured alive and used as targets in shooting galleries. By the 1880s, the only place where passenger pigeons still abounded was in the state of Michigan. Even though well aware of the danger, one Michigan hunter still exported 3 million in a year. And then, very quickly, the passenger pigeons were gone. It's now thought that large numbers were necessary for their survival. There couldn't just be a few passenger pigeons. The last one was seen and shot in 1900. The last captive one, a female named Martha, died in 1914 in Cincinnati Zoo. Her death was reported in all the nation's newspapers, and Americans are still asking themselves, what happened to the rest? The loss of the Wake Island rail is possibly the only case where it could be argued that a clear choice existed. Should an animal species or a human life survive? At the height of the Battle of the Pacific during World War II, Wake Island was chosen as a strategic location for a Japanese army base. For the tiny, weak flying rail, this human invasion was to be as deadly as the battle the soldiers were about to face. The rails form one of the most ancient and widespread bird families in the world, with their origins dating as far back as 70 million years. Since it is a weak flyer, how the Wake Island rail became established on this remote outpost remains a mystery. Quite possibly it evolved into an extreme variant of the Philippine banded rail and lost the ability to fly well because of the lack of natural predators on the island. The rail family includes crakes, coots, and gallinules. They are found throughout the world, apart from the polar regions, and they have colonized all the major oceanic islands. They varied in size, from that of the diminutive robin through to the bulky goose. Like this wader, which looks similar to the Wake Island rail, it could easily be recognized by its sharp, jerking movements when scavenging amongst reed beds. Its typical narrow body was well adapted for running through underbrush and thick grasses. It displayed striking plumage for the often monocolored rails, but was well camouflaged for its habitat. Wake Island is a tiny mid-Pacific island of low-lying scrub, reeds and tussock grasses, a perfect environment for a small land wader. Until World War II arrived on the shores of the remote wildlife haven. Besides devastation, war also brought hungry soldiers. The Wake Island rail was about to encounter its first real threat. Unfortunately for the little bird, the garrison on Wake Island became isolated. Hard-pressed for food, the soldiers easily captured the unsuspecting rail because of its attraction for red cloth, which lured it like a worm on a hook. Soon the rail became the mainstay of the soldiers' diet, and they were hunted down. The effect on nature of the war spread throughout the Pacific. American-occupied Midway Atoll was home to the Laysan rail. It was treated as a pet by the soldiers and encouraged to forage for crumbs around their tables. Tragically, however, rats were introduced to Midway Atoll from naval landing craft. The rats quickly killed Laysan rails and their young, devouring their eggs too. Never having known a predator before, these ground-nesting birds were quickly wiped out. By 1944, they were all gone. At the same time, the Japanese soldiers had eaten every rail on Wake Island. It's hard to blame them. Just imagine thinking, it's either the bird or me. Many of the Japanese garrison did not survive either. Peace finally came to Wake Island. However, the quiet reed beds, empty of land bird life, confirmed that the Wake Island rail was gone forever. There was only one known MARION'S giant tortoise, the very last of its species. It was the oldest living vertebrate animal on Earth, possibly over 200 years old. Giant tortoises survive in only two places in the world, the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific and the Aldabra Islands in the Indian Ocean. There were once at least 6 species. However, because of its survival into the 20th century, the only species known to have come from this small collection of islands is MARION'S tortoise. Among the largest of all giant tortoises, MARION'S tortoise weighed up to 230 kilograms and measured up to 1.2 meters across the shell. They were browsing animals, spreading out during the day, feeding on vegetation. At night, they gathered in large herds. A ship's journal of 1708 from a voyage to the Seychelles recorded a sighting. There are such plenty of land turtles on this isle that sometimes you see 2,000 or 3,000 of them in a flock. They meet together in the evening in shady places and lie so close, one would think those spots were paved with them. This historical picture is now all that remains of MARION'S giant tortoise. The early mariners were first to encounter these fascinating giant beasts. Both military and trading vessels used islands dotted along trading routes like well-stocked larders, raiding them for fresh food, especially meat. It was for this very reason that the most famous of all animal losses came about. The Reunion dodo vanished towards the end of the 17th century. But giant tortoises too were a plentiful source of fresh meat. One animal alone could feed a whole ship's crew, so, in turn, they were just as doomed as the dodo. The sailors killed so many animals that they could gorge themselves on fresh meat for days and still have a surplus. For hungry sailors, surviving on poor diets, the discovery of the giant tortoise was cause for celebration. At first, the sailors salted the tortoise meat and rendered the remains down for fat. Later, they found that the animals could survive for months in a hold without food and water. Ships' records of the early 18th century note cargoes of between 1,000 and 6,000 giant tortoises, prolific sources of fresh meat. But numbers of giant tortoises throughout the Indian Ocean plummeted. They were being eaten out of existence. In 1766, a fully grown giant tortoise was taken from the Seychelles to a French garrison on Mauritius by the explorer Chevalier Marion de Fresnes. When the British captured the island in 1810, the creature too was formally surrendered. Known as Marion's tortoise, it was the only living specimen of its kind. This great lonely beast saw empires rise and fall in his time, and governments come and go. By 1918, the tortoise had completely lost its sight. As the end of World War I was celebrated, the creature died, not as one would imagine of old age, but by falling off a gun turret. It's known for certain that the animal was at least 180 years old. During his last 120 years, he was the only representative of his species. Perhaps that was why Marion's tortoise had clung on to life so dearly, and for so long. Pigeons and doves are traditional symbols of peace and love, but for the Bonin wood pigeon, its peaceful nature was to lead to its own downfall. Even more than these gentle laughing doves, the Bonin wood pigeon was a trusting bird, fearless, one might say, or perhaps naive. In the Middle Ages, one chronicler wrote, "The dove is a simple fowl, free from gall, and it asks for love with its eye." Those qualities that earned it love and protection also made it a target for persecution. The Bonin wood pigeon was the largest of its kind, measuring as much as 44 centimeters in length. It lived in the dense forests of the tiny Bonin Islands in the North Pacific, 500 miles southeast of Tokyo Bay. They were delicately coloured with green and purple, gold and grey, and, as with all true lovers, they mated for life. There were no predators on these islands, and no mammals, except for a few bats. The pigeons fed blissfully on seeds, fruits and berries, as if in a Garden of Eden, a place with no understanding of fear. Man's first recorded encounter with the Bonin pigeons was in 1827 when Captain Beechey of HMS Blossom wrote about how many there were and that they suffered themselves to be approached until alarmed by the sound of a gun. It is all too easy to imagine how he made this discovery. Beechey was among the first of many sailors to pass through, though until later in the century, only 2 humans actually lived on the islands, shipwrecked mariners who had decided to stay. One British visitor reported how you could knock the pigeons from the trees and they'd never fly away, unlike other pigeons. The captain of another ship delightedly described knocking them from branches and breaking their legs. He placed them under a tree where they cried out in pain. and those cries brought 70 more birds to suffer the same treatment. Pigeon pie made a feast for the crews of trading ships, who treated the islands like supermarkets and dumping grounds. In 1830, some of them settled, and they demanded a more varied diet. They brought pigs, which ran riot on the islands, and ship's cats, which added further to the pigeons' troubles. By 1853, the traffic of the whaling trade had left 31 humans settled permanently on the 27 islands. With them came hundreds of other mammals that presented a threat to the pigeons for the first time. The steam-driven ships stopped to make repairs and collect firewood, cutting down the trees that were home to all the island birds. They also brought stowaway rats, and with them disease and death for the pigeons. In 1875, the Japanese government annexed the region, and 14 years later, a search showed the pigeons had gone from the larger islands. The humans carried on their mating rituals, and the population grew to 5,000 by 1900. Meanwhile, the pigeons disappeared. Expeditions after the turn of the century found no trace. The peaceful Bonin wood pigeons had been lost. The symbol of love is a trusting dove. Its fate is a symbol of hate. Many animals have fallen victim to human greed and irresponsibility, but it was politics that killed the last remaining herd of Caucasian bison. It is only in America that bison like these still survive in significant numbers. Once there were also 2 European types, distinctly different from their American cousins. One was the Caucasian bison, now extinct. The other was the Polish bison, of which hardly any remain. The Caucasian bison was just as huge as the American species, over 3.5 meters long including the tail, 2 meters high and weighing more than 900 kilos. Living in the Caucasus Mountains, they were adapted for climbing hills. Their back legs were strong and long, their bodies were slender, and they held their heads high. Their horns were shorter than other bison and their coats less woolly and lighter in color. They fed on the grasses, ferns, bark, and acorns of the Russian forests and lived in sparse family groups of about a dozen, unlike the American bison, which prefer to roam the plains in vast herds. The Caucasian bison gave birth in spring, 1 calf a year, or often only every other year. Breeding so slowly was bound to be a problem, were their numbers ever to be threatened. Humans have lived with the bison for thousands of years. Cave paintings show them as far back as the Ice Age. Our ancestors hunted them. But sticks and spears never greatly affected the populations of these mighty beasts. Instead, it was the loss of their home. In the Middle Ages, humans started to cultivate the lands, and with better weapons, the hunters became more lethal. The bison had always been wary of men, and wherever they met them, they retreated to the dense forests. By 1802, just 300 were left, marginalized into the Białowieża forest. That year, Tsar Alexander I conquered the territory and forced out the peasants. He protected the bison there, and for over a century, they were safe. But in 1918, the Tsar was overthrown, and in the midst of the Russian Revolution, many people were killed in the fighting. The bison were regarded as his imperial pets, pampered symbols of his oppressive regime. Having been forbidden to hunt them for so long, the peasants unleashed their revenge. On foot and in cars, they chased them, bringing them down with machine gun fire. every last wild European bison was wiped out. The only survivors were those the Tsar had given as gifts. There were enough Polish bison to establish a breeding program which continues today. In the same reserve, once protected by the Tsars, there is now a herd of about 500. But for the Caucasian bison, the revolution left only one survivor, a bull called CAUCASUS. He died in Hamburg on the 26th of February 1925. In the people's struggle for freedom, he became a lonely captive, an innocent victim of political oppression. Sometimes humans get greedy and take too much from the dish of Earth's finite resources, and sometimes that means in the end we have to go without. The blackfin CISCO was a member of the whitefish family, living near the surface of the deep waters of the American Great Lakes. There were once so many that it is hard today to believe that in less than a century their numbers dropped from billions to nil. It swam freely in the water, feeding on plankton through its gills, rather than skulking in the depths like some other closely related fish. The blackfin CISCO was silver-grey in colour, except for a stripe of black along its spine from which it gets its name. It was also sometimes called the jumbo herring, because even though they weren't related, it did resemble a large herring. And like the herring, it was good to eat and was fished in vast numbers. Whitefish have always formed part of the European diet. Viking runes, 1,000 years old, tell of the introduction of whitefish to a Nordic lake, one of the earliest records of wildlife management. When Europeans settled in North America, they found the blackfin CISCO especially tasty and a good-sized meal. Being so plentiful, they were also easy to catch. A bustling fishing industry established itself by the CISCO's lakes, the most profitable fishery in the region. The CISCOs were fished relentlessly, with no regard paid to when they were spawning. In fact, the fishermen put out more nets in autumn because it was easier to catch the fish as they swarmed towards their breeding pools. They even put huge nets between the small islands to catch anything that tried to get through. Each net on each boat pulled out as many as 9,000 kilos of blackfin CISCOs in a day. In 1855, one lake yielded over 13 billion kilos. So many fish were caught that there were too many to eat. Without refrigeration facilities, they rotted and were just dumped. Even in winter, the fishermen broke holes in the ice and dropped lines, but they were still easy to catch. Using only a small pearl button for bait, one man recorded taking 135 kilos of CISCO. But it couldn't go on. By World War I, the stocks had collapsed and the commercial fishermen lost interest. But a new threat loomed. The monumental St. Lawrence River lock system had been completed, and now the lakes were used by massive ocean-bound logging vessels. As these mammoths passed through, they flushed out their bilge tanks into the lakes. In that bilge water were alien creatures like sea lampreys. The lampreys dealt the first 2 fatal blows to the blackfin CISCO. They began to prey on the few that had survived the fishing nets. The boats themselves delivered the second: pollution. The oil and sewage from the ships and coastal industry killed off the last of the blackfin CISCOs. Since 1955, there hasn't been a single reported sighting. Pollution and fishing practices that don't allow fish to breed are destroying fish stocks all over the world, at sea and in freshwater lakes. A warning sign is when the fish that are caught get smaller. The story of the blackfin CISCO is another warning. So far, we have ignored both.